A scream rang out, then abruptly fell silent as if someone had crushed it in midair. The small apartment returned to stillness, with only the thick scent of blood lingering in the air. On the floor, a woman had collapsed, a head wound visible, deep red bruises circling her neck where pressure had been applied. The man stood over her, eyes wide and unblinking as he stared at the body. Then he turned and walked out the door, calm, as if discarding something broken. His name was Theodore Johnson, and this was the third time he had killed a woman who once called him lover. Part 1. Blood in silence. On the afternoon of the 15th of December, 2016, officers from the Metropolitan Police entered a semi-detached house in the Goodmays area of East London following an emergency call from nearby King George Hospital. The call originated from a man who had survived a suicide attempt by leaping in front of a train at Cheshire Railway Station. The caller identified himself as Theodore Johnson. Inside the residence, law enforcement discovered the body of a 51-year-old woman named Angela Best. The victim was located in the living room. She was lying supine on the floor, partially covered by a bathrobe. A visible indentation across her neck indicated signs of manual strangulation. Next to the body, a bloodied metal bar, approximately 18 inches in length, showed spatter consistent with blunt force trauma. There were cranial injuries on the left parietal region, consistent with repetitive strikes. No signs of forced entry were identified at the scene. Windows were intact. Door locks showed no tampering. The victim's handbag, wallet, and personal items were undisturbed. The living room bore no indications of ransacking or defensive struggle. A child's toy was seen undisturbed in a nearby corner, and a coffee mug remained upright on the table. These details support the assessment that the victim was not anticipating an immediate threat. Medical personnel estimated the time of death to be approximately 5 to 6 hours prior to discovery. Rigor mortis had partially set in. Post-mortem analysis later confirmed death by ligature strangulation, compounded by blunt force trauma. The perpetrator's attempted suicide occurred less than 3 hours after the presumed time of death. Train station CCTV footage revealed Johnson arriving alone, purchasing a ticket, and waiting on the platform before walking toward an oncoming train. The act was neither spontaneous nor obstructed, suggesting premeditation rather than panic. The survival of the suspect, albeit with the loss of both arms, is considered incidental rather than indicative of intent. Investigators found no signs of disorder in the kitchen, bedrooms, or hallway. The victim's bedroom was locked from the outside. Angela Best's mobile phone was powered off and placed inside a kitchen drawer. One page from a lined notepad was discovered under a cushion on the sofa. The page contained handwritten notes referring to past violent incidents and a statement of intent to end a relationship. No envelopes, postage, or signs of distribution were observed. Angela Best and Theodore Johnson had been in a long-term domestic relationship for over 2 decades. However, Johnson failed to disclose this relationship to the mental health monitoring authorities, violating the conditions of his supervised release following prior homicide convictions. Surveillance protocols at the time required disclosure of new intimate relationships, particularly due to Johnson's history of gender-targeted violence. Angela Best was unaware of Johnson's prior criminal history, including 2 known homicides involving female partners. This concealment was made possible through controlled access to Johnson's psychological records and the absence of cross-reporting between parole and mental health services. Behavioral analysis indicates consistency with prior homicides committed by the same subject. In all 3 known instances, the victims were women with whom Johnson had developed emotional codependency. Termination of the relationship preceded homicidal action in each case. The acts were followed by calculated or symbolic gestures, such as confession letters, self-injury attempts, or feigned remorse. The concealment of personal items and the absence of chaotic disarray at the crime scene suggest behavioral rehearsal and situational familiarity. The subject's pattern reflects a fixation on interpersonal control, particularly in contexts involving perceived rejection. This fixation escalated over time but maintained ritualistic elements. In the 1981 and 1,993 cases, the victims were killed in residential settings after attempts to distance themselves. In 2016, the same trajectory occurred, with increasing sophistication in manipulation and concealment of relational data from authorities. Johnson's history includes periods of institutionalization within psychiatric facilities under the Mental Health Act, following homicide by asphyxiation. Psychological evaluations consistently categorized his affect as flat but cooperative. No psychotic features were documented. His capacity for social compliance appeared intact in structured settings, but was offset by compulsive dominance in private, especially toward intimate partners. The absence of forced entry, combined with relational familiarity, nullified the usual resistance indicators at the scene. This, in combination with the victim's lack of recorded police complaints, points toward coercive normalization within the relationship dynamic. The sequence of events observed at the Goodmays property corresponds with a high-functioning perpetrator profile capable of behavioral compartmentalization. The calculated concealment of the relationship from supervisory bodies for over 20 years suggests long-term, premeditated deception rather than acute psychological instability. The consistency of method blunt force trauma followed by ligature strangulation and the post-crime gesture of suicide align with previously recorded behaviors in Johnson's criminal history. The scene presented no elements inconsistent with an intentional and cognitively intact offender. The convergence of 3 homicides over a 35-year span, committed under varying legal statuses, including parole and psychiatric release, raises structural questions regarding oversight and interagency information sharing. The pattern of relational concealment, combined with unprovoked escalation following separation, may indicate an enduring pathological schema rather than situational impulse. The lack of forced entry, combined with item concealment, may reflect pre-existing psychological conditioning. Part 2, the first fall. On the 8th of January, 1981, at approximately 6:30 a.m., emergency services responded to a call reporting a fall from a high-rise residential block in Wolverhampton, West Midlands. Upon arrival, officers located the body of a 27-year-old woman, identified as Evon Johnson, lying on a paved surface adjacent to the building. The victim had fallen from the 9th floor. Medical response teams declared her deceased at the scene due to catastrophic blunt force injuries consistent with vertical impact from a significant height. The apartment shared by Yvonne Johnson and her husband, Theodore Johnson, was located on the same level from which the fall had occurred. The balcony railing was measured at a height exceeding 1 meter, which would require either a deliberate climb or an external force to overcome. No forensic traces indicating suicidal behavior were present at the scene. No note was found. Toxicology later revealed no substances impairing cognitive function. Initial interviews with the husband suggested that the fall occurred during a verbal altercation in the corridor, resulting in an unintended loss of balance. A resident living in a neighboring unit reported hearing raised voices preceding the impact. The witness later stated that he observed Theodore Johnson in direct physical proximity to the victim at the time of the fall. His statement indicated the application of force contradicting Johnson's original narrative. This testimony introduced direct eyewitness evidence inconsistent with an accidental fall. Despite the testimonial evidence and architectural constraints at the scene, Johnson was not immediately charged with murder. During pre-trial detention, he drafted a handwritten letter addressed to a neighbor, claiming that he had suffered emotional and physical abuse from his wife over a sustained period. He portrayed himself as a victim of psychological degradation and described the incident as the result of cumulative emotional distress. The contents of the letter were reviewed by both legal counsel and law enforcement prior to dissemination. Analysts noted that the structure and tone of the writing lacked spontaneous affect but demonstrated narrative intent. The emphasis on disproportionate victimization, as well as the inclusion of unsolicited biographical context, suggested an attempt to frame public and judicial perception. The act of circulating the letter within the community had measurable impact, resulting in conflicting public opinion and observable sympathy among select peers. Legal proceedings commenced 6 months after the incident. Prosecutors introduced the eyewitness testimony and forensic assessments indicating the implausibility of an accidental fall. The structural height of the railing and absence of risk behavior in the victim's background were emphasized. In response, the defense maintained that the fall was the unintended result of a heated domestic dispute exacerbated by provocation. Psychological stress was introduced as a mitigating factor. During the trial, character witnesses presented by the defense described Theodore Johnson as soft-spoken and passive. The victim was portrayed as dominant within the relationship. No prior police reports of domestic conflict existed. The absence of documented abuse was noted, but ultimately interpreted variably by jurors. The presiding judge acknowledged the complexity of domestic dynamics and stated that Johnson had exhibited remorse and had no prior record of violence. The court ruled that the death did not meet the evidentiary threshold for intentional homicide. Johnson was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 3 years of imprisonment. The ruling introduced precedent-related discourse regarding the threshold for proving intent in domestic violence cases involving fatal outcomes. The judgment rested heavily on subjective interpretation of psychological provocation and the credibility of the defendant's self-reported experience. The sentence length fell below average comparative metrics for equivalent outcomes. Post-conviction behavior displayed by Johnson included consistent compliance with institutional regulations and absence of disciplinary violations. Psychological assessments conducted during incarceration reported flattened affect, low aggression, and high responsiveness to authority. No escalation indicators were recorded during confinement. The eventual release of Theodore Johnson into the community following completion of the full term marked the conclusion of formal state supervision. No additional post-release monitoring protocols were implemented at the time. Records indicate no formal psychological treatment requirement upon re-entry. The reliance on narrative manipulation and calculated emotional framing during legal proceedings represents an early instance of strategic self-victimization. The minimal sentencing outcome, despite conflicting forensic and testimonial evidence, demonstrated a systemic gap in integrating behavioral analysis into judicial determinations of intent. The absence of post-release supervision or structured psychological intervention following a fatal domestic incident raises further questions regarding long-term risk assessment. Part 3, the second silence. On the 2nd of October, 1993, Metropolitan Police responded to a welfare check request concerning a woman named Yvonne Bennett, residing in a flat near Finsbury Park, North London. The request followed multiple failed attempts by family members to contact her. Upon entry, officers located her body in the living room. The cause of death was later confirmed as ligature strangulation. The victim showed no signs of defensive injury, and the scene exhibited minimal disruption, suggesting low resistance and high familiarity with the perpetrator. The suspect, Theodore Johnson, 38 years old at the time, had been in a cohabiting relationship with Bennett for approximately 4 years. The couple had one daughter together. Prior to the homicide, Johnson was not under active monitoring, having completed a custodial sentence 12 years earlier for an unrelated domestic incident. No prior record of violence was formally recorded under his name post-release. Witness interviews and correspondence recovered from the victim's residence indicated a prolonged pattern of psychological control. Multiple acquaintances noted that Johnson exhibited elevated jealousy toward Bennett's coworkers and social contacts. One witness stated that Johnson had shown hostility when learning about Bennett's workplace conversations with male colleagues. The pattern of possessiveness escalated following the victim's stated intention to terminate the relationship and relocate with their child. Approximately 2 weeks prior to the homicide, Bennett filed a police report citing harassment and unauthorized access to her residence by Johnson. In one incident, he reportedly concealed himself in a wardrobe for several hours, waiting for her return. He later emerged and held a knife to her neck. demanding that she reconsider her decision to separate. Law enforcement issued a formal warning, but no restraining order was pursued. No arrest was made due to insufficient physical harm at the time. The murder occurred during a subsequent unannounced visit by Johnson to the victim's home. There were no indications of forced entry, supporting the theory that he had gained access through familiarity or was allowed entry voluntarily. Forensic evidence showed that Bennett was strangled using a belt taken from Johnson's clothing. The timeline of events indicates the killing occurred in the early afternoon while the couple's daughter was present but asleep in a separate room. Following the homicide, Johnson traveled to a nearby police station and surrendered voluntarily. He stated that he had killed Bennett in a moment of anger and expressed intent to end his own life. However, no immediate self-injury was observed. During subsequent interviews, Johnson displayed cooperative demeanor and offered a narrative centered on emotional provocation, consistent with his prior post-incident behavior pattern. A psychiatric evaluation was ordered prior to trial. Reports from medical professionals at Broadmoor Hospital diagnosed Johnson with depressive illness and features consistent with a personality disorder involving rigid thinking, dependency, and emotional volatility. The court accepted the medical recommendation that Johnson be detained under the Mental Health Act for compulsory treatment rather than incarceration. Behavioral review of the case reveals repetition of core traits seen in the 1981 incident. These include relationship termination as a trigger, lack of spontaneous aggression in non-intimate settings, and calculated engagement with authority post-incident. The absence of spatial disruption, along with use of a personal item, belt as the murder instrument, implies both impulsivity and symbolic intention. The victim's minimal resistance further supports the conclusion that the act occurred within a context of psychological coercion or conditioned submission. The psychiatric defense accepted by the court introduced a shift in the classification of Johnson's behavioral profile from criminal pathology to mental illness. This reclassification altered both legal accountability and supervisory protocols. Johnson was not imprisoned, but admitted to a secure psychiatric facility with the expectation of treatment and eventual supervised release. There was no judicial requirement to inform future partners of Johnson's criminal history. No provisions were imposed to mandate notification of personal relationships to supervisory personnel. This regulatory omission allowed for the concealment of risk indicators in future contexts. The diagnostic conclusion cited depressive affect and situational stressors as contributing factors to the offense. However, post-admission observation showed consistent behavioral compliance and emotional restraint. The absence of recurrent psychotic features or disinhibition during institutionalization may suggest cognitive awareness of social norms and behavioral modulation capability. The formal categorization of Johnson's behavior under psychiatric frameworks in the absence of chronic psychosis raises questions about the threshold for forensic mental illness designations. This is particularly relevant when applied to individuals with repeated lethal offenses against intimate partners exhibiting consistent behavioral patterns. The potential conflation of maladaptive personality traits with clinical mental illness remains an unresolved issue in forensic assessments. Part 4, Living a Lie. Between 1995 and 2016, Theodore Johnson maintained a long-term intimate relationship with a woman named Angela Best. Throughout this period, he successfully concealed both his criminal history and psychiatric detention. Johnson was formally released from secure psychiatric care in 1997, subject to conditional supervision, including mandatory disclosure of any new romantic relationships. At no point during the 2-decade period did he notify supervising authorities about his involvement with Best. Behavioral analysis indicates sustained intentional concealment. Johnson constructed a dual existence by regulating the visibility of his partner. During scheduled visits by community psychiatric supervisors, Bess and her children were routinely absent from the property. Items belonging to Best, such as clothing and personal effects, were hidden prior to inspection. This level of environmental staging demonstrates forethought, logistical planning, and situational awareness. Johnson consistently provided plausible explanations when confronted with indicators of female cohabitation. In one documented instance, a community nurse observed a decorative wooden ornament with feminine aesthetics. Johnson claimed he had retrieved it from a workplace discard pile. There is no indication that further verification was pursued. This response strategy, reliant on benign misdirection, reflects a low arousal, manipulative style consistent with high-functioning antisocial traits. Angela Best was unaware of Johnson's 2 previous convictions for the killings of intimate partners. He provided limited personal history, and the absence of publicly accessible records combined with a low-profile lifestyle enabled sustained deception. Johnson maintained consistent employment and avoided confrontational behavior in public or institutional settings. The operational structure of the relationship followed a traditional domestic pattern with shared residence and joint parenting responsibilities. No third-party reports of domestic disturbances were logged during the cohabitation period. Johnson did not display overt control behaviors in public. However, retrospective interviews with acquaintances later revealed subtle indicators of possessiveness, particularly regarding Best's interactions with male colleagues and social autonomy. In September 2016, Best discovered a handwritten letter hidden among Johnson's personal effects. The letter contained retrospective accounts of the deaths of his 2 former partners, including his direct involvement in their deaths. The language used in the letter lacked affective expression and focused primarily on justification and circumstantial framing. There was no indication of remorse or acknowledgement of behavioral accountability. Upon reading the document, Best terminated the relationship and vacated the shared residence. Interviews indicate that Johnson responded with escalating attempts to reestablish contact. Communications became increasingly accusatory, including unfounded allegations of infidelity and abandonment. Johnson exhibited a pattern of entitlement toward continued access to Best and her personal decisions. This phase marked the reemergence of coercive dynamics observed in previous cases. Johnson engaged in persistent, unsolicited contact, initiated unannounced visits, and expressed hostility toward Best's independence. These actions coincided with increasing signs of psychological destabilization, though no clinical intervention was triggered. Despite repeated interpersonal rejection, Johnson maintained outward composure in formal interactions. A scheduled mental health assessment conducted 3 months after the relationship ended noted no overt signs of clinical deterioration. The attending clinician described Johnson as cooperative and future-oriented. No risk alerts were issued. The pattern of behavioral compartmentalization remained consistent with previous incidents. Johnson retained the capacity to modulate external behavior, while internal affective responses to perceived abandonment escalated in intensity. The discovery of the confession letter functioned as a destabilizing factor, disrupting a control-based relational model. The absence of external behavioral cues during this period contributed to the continued underestimation of latent risk. Following Best's separation, Johnson initiated surveillance behaviors, including attempts to gather information about her social activities and new relationships. This mirrored elements of post-separation behavior observed prior to the homicide of Yvonne Bennett. The repetition of this behavioral trajectory, despite psychiatric history and conditional supervision, indicates structural limitations in ongoing risk management frameworks. The concealment of the letter, alongside its content and subsequent behavioral trajectory, reveals a psychological architecture predicated on secrecy, control, and retaliation. Johnson's ability to simulate normative functioning for extended periods, while concealing prior lethal behavior, challenges standard predictive models of recidivism. The absence of institutional detection over a 20-year period suggests that Johnson's behavioral presentation fell below thresholds typically associated with active monitoring. This discrepancy between internal risk factors and external presentation remains a relevant area for further forensic study. Part 5. The monster behind the smile. On the 15th of December, 2016, Angela Best was pronounced deceased inside her residence in East London. The cause of death was confirmed as ligature strangulation, following a cranial injury inflicted by a blunt metal object. The suspect, Theodore Johnson, later admitted responsibility for the killing. He stated the act followed a verbal confrontation concerning the recent dissolution of their relationship. The incident occurred approximately 3 months after Best had discovered Johnson's undisclosed criminal past, including 2 prior convictions for the killings of intimate partners. Behavioral reconstruction of the events leading to the homicide indicates a structured escalation consistent with previously documented patterns. Johnson reestablished contact following separation, engaged in uninvited communication, and demonstrated increasing agitation related to perceived abandonment. These elements paralleled earlier pre-homicide behavior involving both Evon Johnson and Yvonne Bennett. Post-incident behavior included an attempted suicide at a public railway station, resulting in bilateral limb amputation. This gesture repeated a post-homicidal pattern previously observed. However, forensic and behavioral evaluations determined that the attempt lacked immediacy and lethality planning, indicating symbolic intent rather than terminal desperation. The positioning of the act in a highly visible location suggests performative elements aimed at mitigating public perception or judicial consequences. During subsequent legal proceedings, Johnson pled guilty to murder. Sentencing hearings at the Central Criminal Court acknowledged the repetitive nature of his crimes and his historical concealment of prior offenses. He was sentenced to a minimum term of 35 years imprisonment. Judicial statements emphasize systemic failures in interagency communication and long-term supervision protocols. Within the custodial environment, Johnson exhibited withdrawal, limited interaction with others, and passive compliance. He did not participate in offender rehabilitation programs nor express interest in psychological treatment. Reports from prison staff documented verbalized regret, but noted absence of proactive emotional engagement. Medical records later indicated chronic physical deterioration, culminating in his death at the age of 70 due to health complications unrelated to the offense. Longitudinal analysis of Johnson's behavioral profile reveals a persistent pattern of emotional dependency, covert hostility, and retaliatory violence within intimate relationships. His ability to maintain normative external behavior for extended durations allowed him to circumvent traditional monitoring systems. The lack of overt antisocial conduct in non-domestic settings contributed to underestimation of his risk level. The structure of Johnson's offenses reflects an atypical blend of low-frequency, high-intensity violence with significant latency between events. This complicates classification under standard typologies of domestic or serial offenders. The absence of spontaneous aggression, combined with high control over presentation, suggests a subtype of offender whose risk is underestimated due to non-confrontational public behavior. Institutional response across 3 decades demonstrated gaps in data sharing, risk modeling, and post-discharge supervision. Johnson exploited procedural segmentation between mental health, parole, and social services, enabling him to construct a facade of rehabilitation. This case highlights the limitations of static risk assessment tools when applied to individuals with concealed intent and high adaptive functioning. The long-term psychological impact on surviving family members, particularly children who witnessed or were present during homicidal events, remains an area requiring extended study. Secondary trauma, identity conflict, and intergenerational transmission of fear and mistrust are observed in similar cases, though insufficiently addressed in victim support frameworks. Johnson's case underscores the importance of integrated behavioral analysis in long-term offender management. Reliance on static indicators, such as offense-free intervals or cooperative institutional behavior, is insufficient in assessing individuals with demonstrated patterns of targeted interpersonal violence driven by emotional grievance and perceived betrayal. The predictive failure in this case was not a consequence of insufficient data, but of misaligned interpretation and insufficient interdisciplinary integration. Ongoing developments in behavioral threat assessment must account for offenders who deviate from typical escalation models but present cyclical relationship-specific lethality. What are your thoughts on the behavioral conclusions presented here? Do you agree with this interpretation, or would you classify it differently?